All right, well, we still have folks joining us, but we are going to go ahead and get started because we have a ton to talk about today, and we're excited that you're all here. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this morning's session. My name is Adam Herman, and I have the honor of leading the dedicated team of professionals and family members at the Ohio Association of County Boards, which helps all 88 of Ohio's county boards of DD improve the lives of more than 105,000 people and families across the state. It's hard to believe, but we are 2 short months away from the November 5th presidential election. As always, it'll be critical that the voices of people with disabilities are represented in these important discussions about our nation's future, and that they have every opportunity to exercise their constitutional right to vote for our next leader. Service and support administrators at county boards of DD have a unique opportunity to support the individuals on their caseloads who are interested in voting. We hope today's information is helpful and provides you with the key information you'll need to ensure that people you support can successfully participate in this year's election. In addition, for those of you who are joining us today who are people with disabilities yourselves, or who you simply have people with disabilities in your lives and want to make sure they know how you can best support them in the voting process, we appreciate that you are here and hope this provides you with all the information that you need. In a few moments, our panelists will begin our morning presentation. Afterward, we will open up the session for questions via the Zoom Q&A function. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar using the Zoom Q&A function. It's located in your tool panel, probably at the bottom of your screen. And our panelists will answer as many questions as possible during our Q&A session at the end. Unfortunately, it is possible that we will not have time for all questions posed in the Q&A to be answered. That said, we also are not going to be able to answer any questions that are not related to the topic of voting or the topics that we're talking about today, but we might be able to follow up with you after the session if time allows. We'll also be sending out the slides from this presentation to everybody who registered to participate via the email that you used to sign up so that you can reference them over the next 2 months. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and quickly introduce our panelists, and then we are going to get started. So let me share my screen here momentarily. Excellent. All right, so this is our presentation, Uplift Every Voice, supporting people with disabilities in the voting process. I'd like to introduce our speakers here today. With us, we have Jennifer Kucera, who is the chair of the Ohio Olmstead Task Force. We also have Diana Mairose, who is the advocate advisor for Hamilton County Developmental Disability Services. She's also on the board for Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, SABE, a national organization dedicated to self-advocacy. Collin Marozzi is the deputy policy director for the ACLU of Ohio. And Jen Miller is the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. We also have joining us here today, you see her on your screen, Lisa Combs. She is the SSA advisor here at OACB, and she is on here just in case we have some difficult questions that I or one of our panelists might not be able to answer specific to being an SSA in our system. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started with Jennifer Kucera talking a little bit about our first topic here today, which is empowering voters with disabilities and her decision to join in a recent federal lawsuit on voting rights. These are our topics, however, today: empowering voters with disabilities first. We're going to talk about our recent voting rights case, as well as the ways to vote in Ohio, common barriers to voting for people with disabilities, voting accommodations for people with disabilities that are required by law, as well as how SSAs can support voting for people with disabilities and educating people without influencing them, as well as sharing some tools and resources. So without any further ado, Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Adam. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you are here today. Like Adam said, my name is Jennifer Kucera. I was born with a disability, a developmental disability, and I didn't always start out thinking that voting was important. My younger self would be really surprised that I'm here today, because I really didn't even think about voting when I was younger, or even about history. But as I have gotten older and gotten more into advocacy work for people with disabilities, I realized how important voting is. I mean, it's everything. If we don't get involved in voting, the people that make the laws and the rules, nothing will ever change for people with disabilities and for all other things. So voting is so important. It is part of my being now. My own voting experience, I'm going to kind of talk about the lawsuit and my voting experience altogether. So one day, about a little over a year ago, I was contacted by lawyers that literally wanted to know my voting story. So my voting story is this. I used to vote in person. but because of transportation and the fact that I use a wheelchair, it got really difficult for me to get up to the polls. So I started going to absentee voting, but there's a different kind of voting for people with disabilities called the remote marking ballot system that somebody else will talk about later. But what they do is they send me the ballot to my email, and I'm able to just use my mouse and click on the buttons that I want to by myself because I have difficulty writing. And then I have to, I don't have a printer in my house. So I have to send my ballot to my elderly mom because the laws used to be that family could only help you in voting. So I would send it to my mom. She would come over here, and she's 75 and has trouble walking, but she would bring my ballot to me so that I could sign it. And then she puts it in the envelope, and then she takes care of the mailing or the delivering process for me. So when the lawyers asked me, I shared that story with them. And others today will talk about the results of that lawsuit. But it was a personal decision because of how important I think voting is to me. They were over my house. I had to go through depositions where I talked to lawyers and I got questioned for 6 hours. So it was a really long, in-depth process, but I enjoyed every moment of it because I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for all others with disabilities to make the system better and easier for people with disabilities to vote. And on that note, I will turn it over to Collin.
Well, thank you, Jen, and thank you to all my fellow panelists and everybody here attending this webinar during your workday. I want to talk a little bit about the lawsuit that Jen just referred to and that we won, and really why we're here sharing this new development in voting rights in Ohio. So a little bit of background. Under Ohio law, there is a very specific list of family members who may help a voter with a disability return their mail-in ballot, as Jen just mentioned. And that includes your blood relatives like your mother, your child, your father, but also nieces. But what is family members and others that are not included on that list are things like grandchildren, and for this case, most notably caretakers or SSAs like you all. So we challenged that law in federal court to make sure that voters with a disability are able to fully realize their right to vote and are able to use assistance of their choice to help return their mail-in ballot. Next slide, please. So again, what we did was we challenged in federal court Ohio's law prohibiting people of a voter with a disability's choice from helping them return their mail-in ballot. And it was really a very straightforward, pretty open and shut case. And we challenged this Ohio law under the Federal Voting Rights Act. I included a little segment here, and you can see plain as day that the language of the Voting Rights Act does allow a voter who has a disability or perhaps has vision impairment or reading impairments to obtain assistance from a person of the voter's choice, other than their employer or an agent of their union. And I underlined that passage, person of the voter's choice. That was the key phrase of this lawsuit and the key phrase that Ohio law was not compliant with. Next slide, please. And so we won. Again, it was a very straightforward decision. The judge didn't mince words. It wasn't very in depth in the legal weeds. It was Ohio law runs counter to the provisions in the Voting Rights Act that allow voters with a disability to choose a person of their choice. And the restrictions that were in Ohio's law ran counter to that provision in the Voting Rights Act. And though this is a very important and what I think is going to be a very impactful lawsuit, I want everybody here to know that this really simply brings Ohio law into compliance with federal law, and it also aligns Ohio's mail-in ballot procedures with our in-person balloting procedures. In Ohio, currently, if a voter with a disability goes to vote in person, they are able to bring an assistant of their choice to help them cast their ballot. That's already in Ohio law. So this federal ruling really just aligns our mail-in ballot process with our in-person balloting process. Next slide, please. However, some of you may have seen in the news recently that as a result of this lawsuit victory that extends protections to voters with a disability in alignment with the Voting Rights Act, Ohio's Secretary of State Frank LaRose, who is our chief elections officer, issued a new directive to all 88 county boards of elections, kind of tightening who is able to use the ballot drop box, which is outside of the 88 county boards of elections. That's a secure receptacle that voters have been able to go and put their voter registration forms in, their absentee ballots in, and it is just an easier, more accessible option for returning a mail-in ballot. Secretary LaRose issued a new directive essentially saying that for anybody who is returning another person's ballot, so a caretaker or a family member who's returning somebody else's absentee ballot, they must go inside the Board of Elections, return it in person, and then fill out a form essentially saying you are assisting somebody return their mail-in ballot. Now, that is an additional step. It's unfortunate. We believe that everybody should be able to use the ballot drop box, but assistants who are returning a voter with a disability's mail-in ballot are still able to drop it in a public mailbox or in the voter's mailbox at the end of their driveway, or return it inside at the Board of Elections office. So very impactful win we recently had, and I hope we'll see a lot more voting activity based on this ruling. So now I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend and colleague Jen Miller with the League of Women Voters, who's going to kind of walk through the nuts and bolts of voting in Ohio.
Hello, 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 my friends. I am so honored to be here with all of you and all of my esteemed presenters. We're going to talk through quite a few things. And so you might have a question that I'm going to answer. So I'm going to ask that you, if it's a clarifying question about something on the screen, go ahead. But otherwise, I'm going to ask you to hold questions until the end. So let's go. There are 3 ways to vote in Ohio, which means you get choices. The first is you can vote by mail or vote absentee is what we call that. You need to apply for an absentee ballot by October 29th. And this is the only way that if you don't have one of the strict photo IDs that we're going to talk about in a second, this is the only way that you could vote because you can use the last 4 of your social. You can vote early in person. Now, it used to be the early voting, you could also use the last 4 digits of your social security number, but now you actually have to have an ID. Voting early is still a great option, and then you can vote on election day in your neighborhood polling location, and you need photo ID for that too. Next slide, please. So if you're voting absentee or voting by mail, the first thing you do is you need to get an absentee ballot request form. So you have to request that the ballot is sent to you. You can get that from voteohio.gov. You also can use this QR code. We're sending this to you. You can put it in the Dropbox at the Board of Elections, or the absentee request form, you can put it in the Dropbox. You can put it in the mail, but keep in mind that the mail service is kind of slow. So no matter what you do, don't delay, don't wait till the deadline. Next slide. Okay, if you want to vote early in person, you're going to want to check the early vote schedule. Or if you want to bring folks to vote early, you're going to want to check the early vote schedule. There are weekend times, which could be really great, but there's also a lot of times during the day, which could be very good. Next slide. Okay, and obviously neighborhood polling location is open from 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. One side note is when you're returning your absentee ballot, you cannot take it to your neighborhood polling location. A lot of people try to do that. Has to go into, if you're waiting till Tuesday, November 5th, you need to get that into the Board of Elections and they will stay open late, or to the Dropbox. Next slide. So here are some of the barriers that I think you're going to get. Common barriers. The first and foremost is that a lot of times folks are not registered to vote, and there can even be confused about who is eligible to vote. So they must be a US citizen, must be 18 years old on or before election day. So if someone is 17 right now, but let's say they turn 18 on election day, they can register to vote. You need to have been in Ohio as a resident for 30 days. Also, we should have put on here, because a big misnomer is this idea that folks with criminal records cannot vote, but in fact they can. Only those individuals who are actively serving time for a felony sentence are the only individuals in Ohio in the criminal justice process who cannot vote. So let's go to the next slide. Yep, keep going. There's how you can register online, and here's how you can download and print your voter registration form. Okay, so another thing that happens that I think is super important is that maybe someone goes to show up to vote and they've moved. So we want and another thing that just happens is folks get removed from the roll, sometimes on accident, but also if they haven't voted in 6 years. And so it is incredibly important not to just say when the voter registration deadline is, but actually have folks check to make sure that their registration is up to date, that if their name has changed or they've moved, that we get that up to date by October 7th. Next slide. Okay, here are the IDs that are now allowed. One common barrier is that you don't have the proper photo ID. It is heartbreaking to all of us that there's a wide range of alternative IDs that have been removed from the law. So what is allowed? In Ohio, it just needs to be unexpired. If it has a wrong address, you need to have the right address on the voter registration form. But if it has an out-of-date address, but it is not expired, an Ohio issued driver's license, an Ohio issued state ID card. Remember that state ID cards can be free, driver's license or not. A US passport book or card, the military ID, and a US veterans ID. This is a spot where I bet you will have clients that are typically have used a photo ID from the county Veterans Affairs Office. That doesn't work anymore. It has to be the US veterans ID. One note, US Veterans ID at this point are digital, and that is the only digital form that is allowed at the polling locations. So driver's license and state IDs, if you have a digital version of that, those will not work. But the Veterans ID, you literally they don't have physical copies anymore, so that they do have to take that. Next slide. Now, one of the things that happens with photo ID, and I'm sure this happens with a lot of folks in our community, is they may not have the backing documents. And so down below, Vote Writers, free support is there. Vote Writers can help with the backing documents. They have volunteers that will walk folks through getting the various backing documents like birth certificates. They'll even pay for it. So I could see that you have clients that need these documents anyway, and I think this would be a good partnership. They're nonpartisan, they're neutral. They're trying to help folks get their voter ID, which obviously can help with many other services. And again, keep in mind that you can get a free Ohio State ID from the Ohio BMV. We had questions.
Yeah, we did have one question, Jen, while we're getting back on. Wondering, hold on, I'm gonna go. There was a question about, is there any movement in telephonic, like texting, voting coming up?
Yeah, so it takes a lot of work to change the law. So what we are covering right now is how the law stands today. And know that we would love to work with you all to think about, we want to know what barriers you or your clients or other folks within disability communities are experiencing at the ballot box. or through the voter registration process, so that we can think about that when we advocate, or maybe we all work together to do some advocacy after this election is over.
Awesome. One other quick one, and then we'll get going. It looks like we're back on. Is the paper copy that the BMV gives out prior to mailing the normal ballot at the polls?
Yes, that's a great question. So you might remember that now you get a paper copy of your ID, or you get of your driver's license or your state ID, and they mail you the other copy. So that's okay. You can use a paper copy. I don't know if I have any, I can't remember if I have any more slides, Adam. That was a cool thing where you kind of disappeared and came back. Oh, good. Yes, voting accommodations. It's the law. We want our voters to advocate for themselves, and we want to assist in advocating for voters with disabilities if needed. So next slide. Here's a couple things. Curbside voting. Curbside voting is a very great option. Curbside voting works better generally at early vote centers than it does on polling locations, but this is your right. And in fact, in 2004, we won lawsuits. The league and ACLU won lawsuits about the long lines that folks were experiencing, and how that was creating disability access issues. And yours truly, I didn't work for the league then. I was just an election protection volunteer who was part of finding this issue. So how does it work? Voters with disability can vote curbside. What would happen is two poll workers from different political parties would bring out a ballot, and voters have the option to sit in their vehicle to vote, or vote at the door of the polling location. The reason why it works better at early voting is because it's usually better signage and it's better staffed. Sometimes when you go on, you can still have this, you can still curbside vote on election day at your neighborhood polling location. I will say, however, that you should potentially bring someone with you to go in and let the poll workers know that they need curbside voting. You are not required to state why or how you can't enter the polling location. Poll workers are not allowed to ask. If they do ask, we want you to report that to the various hotlines you'll get later. Next slide. Okay. Also, it's law that you have assistance, that you can have assistance marking a ballot. If you can't mark, if a voter cannot mark their ballot, or they need assistance, the voter may bring someone to help, someone of their choosing, whoever they choose, which Collin talked about earlier, unless it is their employer or a representative of their union. Or they can ask assistance from two poll workers from different parties to assist them. Next slide. Okay, I think I already did that. Again, no person can tell you how to vote. They can assist you, but they can't talk you out of voting. So again, if you are at a polling location, or you hear someone who is at a polling location and they've asked for assistance, and that assistant tells them how to vote on an issue or a candidate, please report that to the numbers that we have at the end. Next slide. Also, there is a wide range of voting accessible equipment. Voters should contact the board for more information to find out what voting machine features are at their board of elections. One thing you could consider doing is actually having the board of, if you're having a major event, ask the board of elections to bring some of the equipment for your clients to see, or just the general public to see. One thing we've heard is that we've heard a few things. One has been one occasion where the accessible voting equipment was situated in a spot where others could see that ballot. We do need to advocate. Unfortunately, a lot of folks who are running the polling locations or setting up the polling locations don't have sensitivity to persons with disabilities. So there might be things that they don't even notice are a challenge. And when we advocate, it helps other voters who might also be needing those same accommodations. Next slide. So these are the kinds of accessible voting equipment. audio ballots, braille and tactile lettering, large print so you can zoom in. You can have screen or text color contrast. It can tilt or change height. So there's a wide range of accommodations that you should have available to you. And with that, I'm going to head it to Adam, but I think I did see a couple questions. Do you want me to take those now or do you want me to wait, Adam?
Let's go ahead and wait until the end.
Okay,
And
great.
can
We
answer
took
all
some
questions.
before just when we had a technical challenge.
Yeah.
So we will.
Apologies, that technical challenge was me losing internet. And as the person who was driving the presentation, that was very unfortunate timing. But I appreciate that we rallied and got through it.
Take it away, Adam.
All right. Next slide, please. So as all of you who are on this call know, SSAs play such an important role in the lives of people with disabilities by helping them get access to information and help them make choices about things that are important to them. And one of them can be voting, of course. The things that SSAs can do, however, to prepare people with disabilities on their caseloads are impacted by all the things that we just talked about. So first off, getting voters registered before October 7th. It is totally fine to ask people who are of voting age if they plan on voting in the election and if they're registered to vote, if they express an interest in voting. I would recommend just having a print-offs of the voter registration forms available for anybody who might stop in person, or if you communicate primarily over text or through electronic means, sending them a link to the voter registration if they say they'd like to vote and they're not sure if they're registered. You can go ahead and have them register to vote by sending them that form. You can also support voters with requesting an absentee ballot. As we mentioned earlier, the deadline for requesting an absentee ballot is October 29th. So I think as Jen mentioned, you don't want to wait on the mail. Make sure that you ask that question as soon as possible. We all know that some folks with disabilities face challenges with transportation. So getting to the polling location on election day may not be possible. Helping them request and receive their absentee ballots and helping them fill it out as well if necessary is an important thing that SSAs can do. You can also just answer questions about the absentee ballot process and provide support to a person with disabilities without influencing. And that's an important piece that we'll come back to in a second. So you can answer any questions they have about the absentee balloting process. If you don't know an answer to the question, you can always contact OACB if you're an SSA. And we'll be happy to follow up with you. You can also check the Secretary of State's website. They have a great amount of information. We have some links at the end of this presentation that you'll all receive via email that you can use to access disability-specific information about voting in elections on the Secretary of State's website. So that's a great resource that we'll share with you. You can also support voters by returning their absentee ballots, helping them return their absentee ballots by providing them with some postage if needed. That was one of the biggest questions that we heard as we were preparing for this is, well, what if I don't have stamps? You know, a lot of people just don't send things in the mail anymore. Giving someone some stamps, not a big deal. That's perfectly acceptable for a county board to do to help them mail in their absentee ballots, but also making sure that they get mailed in on time. They have to receive that absentee ballot by election day in order for it to be counted, or postmarked rather by election day for it to be counted. So you don't want to wait until the very last minute and risk there's a chance that they won't be counted. Next slide, please. You can also help by ensuring that the people on your caseload have a photo ID. We know that for folks who don't drive, they often don't have a photo ID. In the earlier slide we presented, there are many resources available helping someone get to the BMV so that they can get their picture taken and have their state ID in time for the election is something that SSAs can do. It's also important to help voters educate themselves with nonpartisan informational materials about issues or candidates that are currently on the ballot. It's one thing to want to vote. It's another thing to know enough to feel confident in voting, and SSAs can be helpful in that regard. Again, we'll talk about this in just a second. It's important to support with information without influencing, but you can provide them with nonpartisan third-party informational materials about what's on the ballot. You can also support voters by making a plan with them to vote and get out to the polls on election day. Many folks still want to go to the poll and press the button on the machine if they're able to, and cast their vote in the way that we've casted votes in our country for a very long time. So it's important to make a plan to be able to do that. That means potentially coordinating transportation with their providers, making sure that if they use self-directed transportation options, that they know where to go and where their polling location is, et cetera. So all of these things are ways that SSAs have a unique opportunity to support voters in casting their ballots and potentially reaching their polling location on election day. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, it's very critical that throughout this process, SSAs are there as a resource and not as an attempt to influence anybody's vote or present information that would help guide a person's vote in one direction or another. So it's critical that you remain neutral at all times when you're answering questions about processes, issues, candidates. It's very important to encourage voters to use respected third-party, nonpartisan educational resources. This is a great way to make sure that you remain neutral. If you just provide them with the information, they can make the decisions on their own. Three that we've selected here, and we have another one that's in our resources at the end of this presentation, Ballotpedia at ballotpedia.org. This is a great way to find out about what's on the ballot. I think they have ballots from all over the country. They definitely have them for here in Ohio, and they have explanations for what the issues are about, the candidates that are on the ballot. Fact check is another good one. You know, we are in a national presidential election this year, so it's important that people, you know, hear things and can decide, looking at information, what is true and what is not true. Factcheck.org is a great resource for that. Again, nonpartisan, just looking at the issues, seeing what is accurate and what is not accurate from a factual standpoint. And VoteSmart is another resource here. There's also a League of Women Voters resource later in this presentation that we'll make sure to include as well. But these are three great nonpartisan educational resources that you can send to folks and be confident that they're going to get the information that they need. Next slide. Another way that it's important to remain neutral is you can help. These are examples of explaining the voting process as a person who's gone and voted before. So, for example, you can tell people things like, not every issue requires a vote. So, if you don't know the candidates on the ballot, don't feel pressured to cast a vote there. I know a lot about voting personally, and I still have people on the ballot that I've never heard of either one of them, and I don't feel strongly, so I just skip that. It's fine to say things to folks on your caseload like, if you don't know something, you don't have to answer it. You can skip to the next one. It's important to explain that there are both candidates and issues on the ballot. You know, county boards, for example, we often are on the ballot for our property tax levies. That's an example of an issue. There could be local parks issues. There could be tax issues. There could be other things on the ballot that are not what people traditionally think of when they think of an election, which is voting between one or more candidates. Helping a person understand the differences between those types of votes so they don't get confused when they're there on election day is absolutely an appropriate thing for an SSA to explain about the voting process. Also, it's important to remind folks that voting is private and confidential. It's up to that person if they want to talk about their vote after they've cast their vote, but that they should never feel obligated to do so. This is especially important because of the often heightened scrutiny that people with disabilities are under in the voting process. It's unjustified, but it happens, and people shouldn't feel like they have to answer to anybody for anything that they do in the ballot box, and they should know that. In SSAs, you are more than able to tell them about that. Next slide. It is critical that there is never any attempt to influence the vote of a person with disabilities. Examples of ways that you can do this without realizing you're doing it would be sharing your personal voting preferences, or that the voting decisions you've made either in this current election or in past elections. It's important that SSAs are seen as just a source of information, not a source of persuasion. So even just by stating, you know, the person on your caseload, if you're an SSA, might think very highly of you and therefore think that they should probably vote like you. It would not be appropriate for an SSA to share their voting preferences or any decisions they've made in the past, because many people could interpret that as an endorsement or as some other emphasis on a particular candidate or a way to vote on a personal issue. It's also important not to share biased or partisan information about issues or candidates that would favor one person or issue over another. That's why those third-party, independent, verified sources of information are so important. You can tell people to visit individual candidates' websites as long as you say visit all of the candidates' websites and make a decision based off of that. You can't just say, here, go to this presidential candidate's website and look up the issues and see how you feel about them. Make sure that you're encouraging all website visits and other sources of information before making a choice. Similarly, only sharing information about just one candidate or issue advocacy group when multiple choices are on the ballot would be seen as influencing. So again, just making sure that you're covering all of your bases to make sure you're not influencing a person's vote unjustifiably by providing them with a lopsided view or with only information that you've chosen to give them, which could lead them to make a particular decision. Next slide. The bottom line is, if you're in doubt of whether or not you're going to influence a person in their decision-making, just leave it out. It's not worth it. There are so many sources of information online that you can send people to. It's just best to stay on the side of caution so you never get caught in a situation where someone feels that they've been influenced by you, or someone, especially maybe someone in that person's family, feels that you've been influencing a person on your caseload to vote in a particular way. It's just not worth it, so just leave it out. With that, we're going to go ahead and transition to Diana, who's going to share a few closing thoughts before we share some resources and then open up for questions. So Diana, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me today. My closing thoughts on voting is, remember it's your own choice. And also remember, if you haven't voted before and want to vote, ask your friends or your family or your SSA, how can I vote? And sometimes my first time was really scary. I was very nervous. I felt that people were watching me. But once I got done voting and I put it in the box and I proofread everything before I turned it in, I felt hopeful. And sometimes when you feel hopeful, you know you made a difference. And it's okay just to vote for one person or for one levy or for one issue. But it's also important to be prepared to vote, to make sure you have everything you need before you leave your house, or have all the information you need when you vote in a home. Voting is something that allows me to take part of the community and make our community more safe and accessible for people of all abilities. And one vote can make a difference. You can also help during election day. And you can be a poll worker. You can volunteer, and you can get people registered to vote. So civic engagement is something that helped me become a stronger voter, because I understood what the Board of Elections was. I understood who I could contact. I understood who can help me if I have any concerns or ideas that could help me become a better citizen. Your voice is your vote and your choice. I always say if you need help, speak up. If you don't know where to speak up, go to your county board of elections. Ask questions. Be involved in helping them make it easier for people with disabilities to vote. There are some tools that I like to talk about. I am the Region 5 representative for self-advocates becoming empowered. We do a lot of voting work, and we are working on white pages for voting needs that will be out shortly. We work with national voting leaders and state voting leaders so that our voice can be heard. We have done surveys in the past, and we have voting toolkits that can help people you serve understand voting more. Please go to www.saveusa.org for more information, and thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you, Diana. I appreciate you sharing that information. You had mentioned Save USA as a great resource. And in fact, we're going to share some more resources now. So next slide, please. Again, we're not going to go through each one of these, but registering to vote, we wanted to put these links here. You can also update your voter address through that same link. You can check voter registration. This is a way that SSAs can specifically help people with disabilities on their caseloads if they're not sure if they're registered to vote. If they're there with you in the office, you can look up their voter registration with them right here at that link. You can also find those early voting centers with a link on the Secretary of State's website, the fourth bullet on this page. It's important that if you're concerned at all about a person being able to find transportation on election day, there's 2-3 weeks before the election, all those dates that were in the previous slide where boards of election, early voting centers are going to be open, and that may offer a much better opportunity for people with disabilities to get to the polls. And also, if you think that they might require some extra time and there's usually lines out the door at the polling location they're going to go to, it might be good to go to an early vote center in order to give them a more relaxed experience instead of being worried that they've got dozens and dozens of people behind them. That could be an opportunity as well. Next slide. This is the link to request a mail-in absentee ballot. We also had those QR codes. Feel free to print off these slides when we send them out to you and just have that QR code at your desk or in your cubicle, or send out this link to folks if you communicate with them primarily through electronic means so that they can request their mail-in absentee ballot ahead of time. You can also use this Secretary of State's website link to find polling locations. All you need is the person's address, and that will show exactly where their polling location is on election day. Next slide. Again, we have links here about how to obtain an Ohio photo ID. We know a lot of people with disabilities who don't drive don't have a photo ID already in the form of a driver's license. So you can get one at any BMV. You can also go to voteriders.org and get assistance for folks who may need help getting a photo ID and would like to use their services. Next slide. These are some great disability voting resources from the Ohio Secretary of State's website. The Secretary of State has a disability voting unit that has an ADA coordinator, and they've created a lot of great materials. I highly recommend that SSAs check out this website. There's the voting FAQ link here, as well as some disability voting myths. One of the myths, for example, is that if a person has a guardian, they can't vote. That's not true. It's only true if a person has been found incompetent by a judge for voting purposes. That's a very specific designation. There are a lot of great myths in there that would be good to familiarize yourself with. That way, if people ask you questions, you already have the answer and you've seen the official response from the Secretary of State's website. Next slide. These are 2 election day hotlines that are helpful to hand out to folks. So if they have any challenges or trouble at the polls whatsoever, that they can call these numbers and have someone potentially make calls to the right people and make those issues go away. Disability Rights Ohio is the state's protection and advocacy organization. They run an election day help hotline that is available on election day from 6:30 a.m. until 7:30 p.m. all the times that the polls are open. You can call the numbers listed here, 614-466-7264, as well as 800-282-9181. Both of those election hotlines can be called. In addition, we have 866 Our Vote, which is the nonpartisan election protection hotline. It looks like that got cut off there at the end. Sorry about that. But nonpartisan election protection hotline, 866 Our Vote. Next slide, please. These are some of those voter education resources, Ballotpedia, Fact Check, Vote Smart. We covered those in a previous slide, as well as that League of Women Voters website that has information about candidates, and they have candidates actually specifically answering questions on that website at vote411.org. Again, that's vote411.org. Next slide. And we actually, as a result of coming together on this webinar, we've created a postcard with the help of ACLU Ohio that is endorsed by all the organizations that are involved in putting on this webinar, including OACB. This is something that county boards can request. So ACLU is willing to print these up so that SSAs who are participating on this call today can order free postcards, and all they have to do is put a person's name and address on it and a stamp. And get those postcards out to people so that they know their voting rights and they know some important information about voting on Election Day on November 5th. This is totally appropriate for an SSA or a county board to send out because it contains just nonpartisan informational material about elections. So if you'd like that, we're going to send the link out in the email to all participants who are here today to order these postcards. Again, these are free of charge. They'll be sent directly to the individual name. We do ask that if you have multiple folks on from your county board, that you only process one order so that we have one definitive order and we're not having 2 people maybe requesting from the same board the same number and not realize that we have other excuse me, I saw something in the chat there for a second, that we have other orders processed. Next slide, please. We have additional information available for anybody who would like to email us as well. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us directly. There's also a link to find your local board of election on this slide. All of these links, we'll be sending these out as a PDF. All of these links will be hyperlinks. And please feel free to email us at any point if you have questions about the things that we've said in our presentation here today. So next slide. We have reserved some time at the end. We want to thank everyone for being here, but we reserved time at the end for question and answer. So if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A, and we'll be happy to answer them at this point. I think all of our folks are going to turn their cameras back on and join us. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll be happy to answer them at this time.
Thanks, Adam. There is a question that we didn't get a chance to answer a little bit earlier, so I'm going to go back to that one. Kathy asked, if your daughter is 18 and votes absentee, does the mom or guardian have to go in and fill out the form that she assisted?
No.
Jen.
So because the daughter, I mean, because it's her mom is on the allowable list of helpers.
Okay.
Correct, Collin?
Yeah, so the mom is always able to return it by, a mailbox. If they want to take it to the Board of Elections, they will actually have to go into the board personally to deliver it. The directive that Secretary Marozzi issued essentially made clear that you are only able to deposit your personal ballot into the ballot drop box. So even when we talked about that family list that was allowable, those family members now are wrapped up in this requirement of having to go into the Board of Elections as well. So only your personal ballot can go in the drop box.
So there's actually, yeah, there's two forms. There's two what they call attestation forms. There's one for family members dropping off their ballots in the ballot box. And then there's one for caregivers that are dropping off the ballot in the ballot box for somebody else. So
So-
once you go into the BMV, they will give you the appropriate form.
Or the BOE, right? The Board of
I'm
Elections.
sorry, yes, the Board of Elections, yes, sorry.
I'm so sorry to make this confusing, but Miss Jennifer, we just had a conversation with the Secretary of State. And it is unclear how many, we just had a conversation about implementation yesterday. And they're thinking it's one form that you just check different boxes. But here's the thing that's different, unfortunately, is that yes, at home, you know, if it's stuffing the envelope or reading or things like that, putting it in the mailbox at your house, you don't have to attest to anything. It's just if you are not the actual voter and you are returning it directly to the Board of Elections, you can no longer put that in the drop box. You have to walk that in. So
Someone
Awesome.
asked the question, can't you just mail it in? And the answer is,
yes,
like, mailing it in is by far the best and the easiest way to ensure that your ballot gets there, as long as you do it long before election day and you've
Yep.
requested it beforehand, make sure that it'll get there on time. But yes, mailing it in is the best way if you're doing absentee. Don't worry about a drop box, just put it in the mail and get it there. But Jen, you want to say something? I can tell.
I should have mentioned that you can track your ballot. You can actually keep track of your absentee ballot. So before we are sending these slides out, Adam, we should add
Sure.
that.
Yeah, be happy to do that. That's a good point. People, if they're, wanting to make sure their vote is counted, each one of those ballots has a unique identifier on it, and it'll be scanned, and you'll know when it's received.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
No, just some great comments about how awesome you all are, including a specific shout out to Diana. So thank you, Diana. You're famous and you're awesome. I appreciate that.
And someone asked a clarifying question in the chat about they just said BMV question mark. That's the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, your local registrar, wherever folks would go to get their driver's license, is where you can get your state ID. So that's why we mentioned the BMV earlier.
And I also we talked about one of the misnomers, but we didn't talk about the other. And I think you all know this, but please reiterate to all of your clients that if they have a guardian, they still are able to vote. That, and if a poll worker questions someone's ability to vote because they present as someone who may have, various challenges, they're not allowed to do that. Okay. So the two biggest misnomers I think we have in terms of eligibility for voting, one is about criminal kind of justice issues where it's only someone serving time for a felony. The other has to do with individuals with disabilities. The only time that someone can't vote is if a judge rules them incompetent to do so. So even if a judge has said that they need a guardian, that doesn't take away their right to vote.
Yeah, and I will say that's very rare that someone
It is so rare. But Adam, let's make sure we get that. We should have one slide about that in there.
Absolutely. So I don't see, or wait, do we have any more questions? I see one just came in.
Just some clarifications. Oh, here, before we get to the first one, let's say, can DSPs, that's direct service professionals, assist individuals with their selections and cast the vote on behalf of the person requiring more hands-on assistance? So that's going back to, I think, that list of what you would have to do and how you're helping the person. I would go back to Jen. And so a service provider that's being paid, what would they need to do to be able to assist?
So there's a difference between whether they're doing it through the absentee process.
At the polling center, it says.
Yeah, at the polling center, absolutely. Any voter can ask for a helper at the polling. They don't even have to say why. they want a helper. Any voter can ask for a helper. It just cannot be their employer or a representative of their union.
Awesome, thank you. The other question that came up a couple times, Adam, is just about, since this wasn't a registration in OACB, is there, how are we getting evaluations and anything mailed out and CPDOs?
Well, that's a perfect segue into the last part of our presentation today, which is just some general housekeeping. And that is that we are going to be sending out the slides to all the email addresses that were registered for this webinar. We'll also put it in Member Connect for those of you who are members of OACB. That's where you get a lot of your information from us. If you are interested in claiming a superintendent or SSA continuing education credits, we'll be including a link in that follow-up email as well for this purpose that you can fill out and obtain a certificate to show that you attended this today. And with that, and absent a couple other updates we're going to make to slides, I think that's all the information we have to share with you today. We very much appreciate the time that you spent with us here, and we'll be getting that email out here probably before the end of the day, but certainly by Monday with all of the information I just shared. So thank you again for being here, and get out there and vote yourselves and help other people vote for the presidential election on November 5th. And I hope you all have a great weekend. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.